Hi everyone, and welcome to my vlog on the coaching process. The purpose of this video will be to highlight certain coaching behaviours of my own and analyse their effectiveness and how they could improve. I'll specifically be looking at my behaviour regarding certain coaching styles and how they differ depending on the content and athlete I'm coaching. To add to this, I'll be reviewing my use of cues and feedback as part of this coaching behaviour. In order to give my behaviour some context, I'll be outlining relevant parts of my coaching philosophy and then highlighting how they affect the coaching session I've chosen. Two major strands of my coaching philosophy in my current environment are building strong relationships with my athletes and aiming to develop autonomous athletes. Like many things within a coaching process, these are interdependent. I want my athletes to be self-sufficient and understand their own training process, and to encourage this, I try and let the sessions be more player-led as opposed to coach-led. However, deciding when an athlete is ready for this is highly dependent on how well I know them and the relationship I have built with them. I find this is a good method for developing buy-in and enjoyment within the training process. This is also influenced by the skills being learned or used. Are they cognitive, associative, or autonomous? I find the types of cues and feedback I use are heavily influenced by these factors. Based on this literature, I tend to try and use more external cues, but that doesn't mean to say I won't use internal as well. I find the main benefit of external to be greater skill retention, so I aim to use these more frequently in the early phases of learning. Outcomes of external focus of attention include lower EMG during movement, increased jump height, greater skill retention, increased balance adjustment frequency, and fast reflexive movement control. While outcomes of internal focus of attention include the constrained action hypothesis, or greater EMG. Now, based on this literature, I try to avoid intra-set feedback and limit each set to one cue or focus. This is more important when dealing with an athlete in the cognitive phase of learning, where I adopt more of a command and or practice style of coaching. However, when looking back over my coaching, the use of these cues and the timing of the feedback is something I can do better, which we will see later in the video. Marshall et al. Found that increased frequency of feedback showed absolutely no influence on sport task acquisition, and 100% feedback frequency groups showed poorer performance on all retention tasks. While Wolf and Prins suggested that too much feedback can prevent learners from focusing on their own feelings and possibly causing them to focus too much on their own movements. Schmidt and Wolf discovered that when concurrent feedback is provided and then removed, performance then declined. So before looking at the session, I just wanted to put into context some parts of my coaching philosophy, which are summarised on this slide. I aim to provide simple, prioritised, external focused verbal feedback, use a drill to create context if necessary, regress if necessary, allow for repetitions, and do my best to use silence to allow the athlete to concentrate on their own movements. One thing I can definitely do better is use more questions to demand understanding of the athletes to help develop their awareness and understanding of their training process. This session is taking place at a school during private study periods. This means the athletes arrive at different times, and the dynamics of the session and my coaching changes as the session moves from one athlete to eventually 4 at once. The athletes are relatively experienced, with the lowest training age being roughly 6 months and the greatest being 18 months. Now we'll look at some parts of the session and examine whether my behaviours reflect my philosophies. The session starts here in a one-on-one format, where the athlete is drilling the transition and second pull part of the clean. This is the first time this athlete is attempting these skills, and I therefore adopt a practice coaching style, and my attention is solely focused on this athlete for obvious reasons. Where I think I fall short is in my cueing and timing of feedback. Instead of inter-set feedback, I'm giving too many cues to the athlete per set, potentially giving the athlete too much to think about. As I mentioned earlier, I believe it's best to keep information concise and clear, so I think this is an area I can improve upon. I try and use predominantly external cues where possible. Jump and shrug, for example. However, an internal cue such as "I want more glutes" may help the athlete achieve greater levels of triple extension if he or she is struggling. I think using a combination of cues gives the athlete more options regarding finding a cue that he or she can relate to. I find the use of internal cues helpful when trying to encourage understanding of a movement or skill, whereas external cues are better for skill retention. The next phase of the session sees the 4 athletes training simultaneously. The 3 athletes who join have good understanding of their own training and are reasonably self-sufficient regarding their exercises, sets, reps, and rest. Naturally, most of my focus remains on the platform with the heavier and more technical lifts. However, as the session unfolds, I can see areas which require more of my attention. There are small things which I miss, which I assume all athletes are technically sound with. Although small things, I should aim to keep a keen eye on all the athletes as they train and not assume they are completing everything perfectly. This highlights that although they may have shown competence when first taught, they still need reinforcement and monitoring throughout their training process. I shouldn't assume everything is perfect, and therefore spreading my attention more evenly, even for small things, is something I should do better in the future. During this phase of the session, I adopt the coaching behaviours of inclusion and guided discovery. Aiming to develop self-sufficient athletes, I often allow them to choose their own number of sets, between 2 and 5, depending on how they may be feeling on any given day due to multiple kinds of stress they may be going through. This gives them some ownership of the training process and means they can go about their session without me being so hands-on and counting out reps for them. I use praise well throughout the session to reinforce good practice, and the relatively experienced nature of the athletes means, on the whole, I can focus more on the platform. However, like I mentioned earlier, being more thorough with my praise and attention is an area I might look to improve to ensure good technique is being used 100% of the time. Here is an example where we see one athlete complete his counter movement jump, where we can observe that his landing isn't technically perfect. On this occasion, my attention is elsewhere and I failed to correct the movement because of this reason. The same can be said here when the same athlete's push-up and Spider-Man isn't quite what I'm after either. He doesn't remain braced throughout his trunk during the movement, and this is another example of something I may have overlooked. This, however, isn't due to my attention being split, but more me failing to observe and intervene at the right time. Throughout the session, I make efforts to informally ask the athletes about their sport, academics, home life, physical and mental stress, in an attempt to get to know them better and build that rapport. This is a good opportunity to add a bit of humour and keep the session relaxed and enjoyable. I find this helps the buy-in aspect of the training process and softens the perception that an S&C session is just like boot camp, which it is occasionally seen as at my workplace. Looking to conclude, I feel like I employ some good coaching behaviours that stem from my philosophy. Things I think I can do better are limiting my feedback to only one piece of advice per set, and then eliminating any feedback during the movement itself, during the early phases of learning. During the clean practice, I think I did too much talking, and while the athlete picks up the skill quite quickly, I think I can do better to talk less and allow the athlete to deal with the constraints of the task himself. When the skills are learned, I can improve upon the use of positive reinforcement to highlight good practice, as well as monitor more closely to ensure that techniques are mastered. While I have said that I use a combination of cues, I think this exercise has maybe highlighted that external cues are better used in the early phases of skill learning. This is something I will look to act upon in future sessions. Finally, I think I can do better to ask more questions to demand understanding of the training practices and the purposes behind a lot of the things we do. Not only does this help the athlete, but I also think it will help me refine my ideas, think and articulate more clearly, and then be able to convey things in a more concise manner. Here I am to summarise this, briefly highlighting the areas I want to work on. Thank you for watching.